and believed in him. Okay. There is a lot going on in our world right now. And there was a lot going on in the time when Lazarus died. It's hard. It's hard when people die, and it's hard when people get sick. There is a lot of blame going on in the world right now. Some of you may have seen some people are putting out some pretty terrible ideas about why this is happening and how this is happening. And this sermon is not ultimately about why bad things happen to good people, or if we have a good and loving God, why is there suffering in the world? I'm saving that for my Facebook Live video on Wednesday. But today, let's just acknowledge that it's hard and it's confusing. When Mary and Martha's brother died, when Lazarus died, they were probably also confused. They were probably also overwhelmed. What I want to do today is invite us to think about the journey that Martha and Mary went on. I want to invite us to think about the before time, the time when Mary and Martha and Jesus were all hanging out together, and Lazarus, and they were friends, and they visited each other and hung out together and probably ate meals together and did things together. There was the before time. And then Lazarus gets sick, and then Jesus doesn't come when we think Jesus should. Jesus isn't there at the moment that Mary and Martha think that Jesus should be there. But what's interesting about this passage is, do you know who is there? Who is there is the community. The people come and they surround Martha and Mary and Lazarus during this time when Lazarus is sick. And then Jesus waits too long to go for who knows what reasons. And once Jesus gets there, his friend Lazarus is dead. And Jesus weeps. It says that Jesus began to weep. I think it is so important right now and so comforting to know that Jesus weeps with us. When people die, Jesus is sad with us. When people are hurt and sick, Jesus cries with us. But Jesus, being Jesus and not simply another random human being, can do things that nobody else can do. Jesus can sit with us in that pain, sit with us in that grief, and Jesus is big enough to handle all of the grief. I know that lots of people are sad because things are canceled, because we're lonely, because we're separated. My family's spring break trip got canceled. And then there's also the grief of people being sick and people dying and people being in the hospital. Our world is so heavy with grief right now. And Jesus sits with us in that grief and weeps with us. But then Jesus doesn't leave us there. Jesus doesn't leave us in that place where we are sad and where we're tired and we're exhausted and where everybody is dying and it's awful. Jesus meets us there in that place and then invites us on a path forward. Jesus invites us forward to resurrection. Jesus invites us to think about what is the thing that comes after. There was the before time when everyone was hanging out together and they were all friends. There was the during time when Lazarus was sick and when he died. And Jesus enters into that during time. He enters into the grief. He enters into being with the people. But then he invites people into a resurrection. He invites people into new life. Here's the thing about that, though. Yes, Lazarus comes out of the tomb and they say, unbind him. And Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead. And the reality of our lives is sometimes people experience miraculous healings and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, they experience resurrection when they get to go and live with God. And we hold on to the kind of little resurrections that we get to experience in this life. The kind of little resurrections that we experience when we come together and when we care for each other. Maybe people are grieving, having lost their jobs, and a little resurrection for them is that the church all comes together and donates and helps them pay some bills so they end up not losing their house. Maybe the resurrection is that you live alone and there is intense grief of feeling lonely and isolated and cut off. And maybe the little resurrection is that Jesus inspires somebody to call you or send you a picture in the mail or say hi or FaceTime with you. One of the things that I think Jesus absolutely invites us to do is to figure out how we are with each other, and then how are we offering these little moments of resurrection to each other? And then there come the big moments of resurrection, right? It comes the time when Lazarus comes out of the tomb. Very soon after we get back to in-person worship, we're going to celebrate Easter twice as a congregation. So we are going to celebrate Easter once over Zoom on April 12th on actual Easter. And then when we gather together as a congregation, maybe the first or second week, we're going to celebrate the resurrection again because Jesus, I know, are you so excited? I am too. Clap if you're just as excited as Miss Novak there. Yeah. We get to celebrate again together because Jesus can come back from the dead as many times as we need him to, because Jesus is always resurrected. Right? And Jesus always invites us into this resurrection promise. The world that we move into is not going to be the same. The thing is, when Jesus brought Lazarus back from the dead, more people believed in him, which means he got more in trouble with the authorities. More people followed him, more people listened to him. It is interesting to me the number of people who are turning to Jesus right now in the world, even people who had no use for church before. Our online presence is increasing and we are reaching the gospel with new people in new ways. People are finding resurrection and hope and connection. And one of the invitations is to let it change us. How many more people will believe in Jesus when we experience the resurrection of all coming together again because of the ways that we were with each other during the time? We won't go back to the same world that we had before the pandemic. We won't go back to everything as completely normal. We'll go back to a new normal. And that's what grief is. Grief is figuring out your new normal. What is my life like without this thing? What is my new life going to be like without this person whom I love and I care for? We're going to go back to a new normal. But here's the great news about that. Jesus is part of that new normal too. Jesus is part of that resurrection too. Jesus will be there with us, and Jesus will bring us to new life and to hope and to resurrection. I invite you today to think about the ways that you can share many resurrections with yourself, with one another, to know that if you are sad and grieving or hurt or sick, Jesus is with you, and to reach out to the church to provide many resurrections for you, and to look forward with hope to the time that we all get to come out of our caves, the time that Jesus unbinds us, the time that we get to worship together again in person and experience a big resurrection. And then how we're going to use that to invite more and more people into a life-saving relationship with the Jesus who always promises us resurrection. You are invited to think and feel and spiritually know resurrection and to share it with others, the way that Jesus did when he unbound Lazarus and the way that Jesus does when he unbinds us. Thanks be to God. Amen.